Hi everybody, I'm out in the tool shed tonight and I just wanted to do a follow-up video of the video about maple syrup 2023. This is the first year that I've actually produced maple syrup, and overall I think it was a success. I met my goal of 1 gallon. Even though had I have known what I know now, I could have had 2 or 3 gallons easily, I think. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to do a short video on lessons I learned from my first season of maple sugaring. The first thing I want to say is for 2024, I've already started a checklist of things I want to do, things I want to achieve, things I can do to make the season go a lot smoother. And the first thing I need to do is have a defined place for my evaporator. As I researched this whole thing, I didn't end up, instead of building an evaporator, I ended up buying one from Smoky Lake Maple. I bought a Dauntless evaporator, which turned out to be an outstanding decision. Originally I was going to build an evaporator, but by the time I looked into that, and all the processes that went into it, my limited skills, the cost for a stainless steel pan, the difference in efficiencies between one you buy and one you build, I decided it was probably money well spent to go with the Dauntless, and I've not been disappointed by its performance. But what I would have to say is I didn't have a place to put it. I thought I could just put a smokestack on and do it from the outside. And I did that and it worked out fine, but I ended up putting it into the end of my sawmill shed, which was somewhat under cover from the wind and rain and other elements. And that worked out pretty well, but it's certainly not the best method I could use. So I've decided for 2024 I'm definitely going to build a dedicated sugar shack, and I've already started developing plans for that. The other thing I would say is make sure you have plenty of dry, very well seasoned wood for your wood-fired evaporator in excess before even starting the season. You go through wood fairly fast in order to have your evaporator running at top efficiency. You need an extremely hot fire, and you'll have to feed it very frequently. Small splits seem to work the best and worked well for me. The other thing that surprised me about this whole process was after I picked the trees and placed my taps, I was astounded by how quickly my containers filled up with maple sap. I put out 35 taps and I used the galvanized covers with the bags, which I was very happy with, but one thing I didn't expect was how fast the bags would fill and how many gallons of sap I would actually have in a one-day period of time. So I initially bought 7 5-gallon food-grade containers, thinking I could use those to collect the sap daily, and then I had a 55-gallon drum and another 275-gallon food-grade container to place the sap in. But the first day I went out to collect sap, I had way more sap in my bags than I did containers to collect them. So I started out behind on the very first day. I rapidly found some more food grade containers and purchased them, cleaned them out with bleach and hot water solution, and collected more syrup. But I collected, within a matter of 3 to 5 days, I collected probably over 150 gallons of sap. Then I had to deal with storing the sap. I used a 55-gallon drum for some of it, and then I realized I really don't have a system of pumping that sap from the container into the pails to pour it into the evaporator pan, so that created a problem as well. Ultimately, I got the evaporator set up in my at the end of my sawmill shed, which kept the evaporator pan and the actual evaporator itself under cover while it allowed the exhaust pipe to be outside. The evaporator worked extremely well, and I was able to boil down sap efficiently, although I was never able to get the sap to the desired temperature in the periods I was boiling. I'd get it to 216 to 218, but in my area I needed 219 to really say that I was at the right temperature to have maple syrup. So I had to finish the sap on a propane-fired burner, which really wasn't a very efficient way to do it. One thing that I realized in the process that deterred my sap from getting to syrup in the actual evaporating pan was that I have a warming pan installed on my evaporator pan, and what was happening is I was feeding the raw sap into the pan too quickly, and it was destroying my gradient from pure sap to near maple syrup, and I never was able to get up to the temperature that I needed, and that was completely my inexperience that did that, and next year I'll know better. The other thing I was doing is I wasn't allowing the sap to boil down to a lower setting. 2 inches is probably ideal, but for the fire I had, 2 inches was still too thick, and I needed to go down probably to 1 and 1.5 inch. And if you stay there, you more than likely won't burn up your pan. So another lesson learned. The other thing I learned during this process was that I did not have the appropriate stainless steel stock pots to filter my syrup. They weren't tall enough, they weren't large enough for the size of the filter, and therefore my first filtering batch of maple syrup was inefficient, and it turned out some very good maple syrup, but I honestly probably could have gotten a lot more had I had a better process. The second round, I bought a much larger 22-quart stock pot, which was sufficient to filter the sap in a better process. But having to do it again next year, I'm definitely going to have either a vacuum filter for the sap, which speeds up the process a lot, or I'm going to buy a filter press, which also speeds up the process, but a filter press is a much more expensive option. I'm also going to incorporate diatomaceous earth into my filtering process, which I think will make a better product. All said, the season here in Indiana and southern Indiana was short. The temperature warmed up very quickly. It got to the point where the trees were budding before the end of February, and I had to pull my taps. I had a short season, but I collected probably 180 gallons of sap. I ended up disposing of about 80 gallons of sap because of my inefficient process, and it sat too long that I didn't feel comfortable using it. So lesson learned there as well. The other thing I would do is I'm going to incorporate a better bottling station and plenty of clean bottles for next year. So what are my future plans for this process? Next year I'll have a dedicated sugar shack, kind of a Vermont style sugar shack. I'll have improved sap containment system with larger containers and ability to pump those out. And I'm hoping to put a float pan on my evaporator for more of an automated process. I want to incorporate a reverse osmosis system to concentrate the sap into a higher concentration of sugar prior to boiling. And I also want to design and have made my own labels for the bottles. As far as growth plans, again, I want to do the float pan for my evaporator. And also I want to tap more trees in the future and have a large enough evaporator to evaporate the amount of sap that I obtain. I have no plans at this point of going to a vacuum system. That seems a little daunting to me. My trees are spread out somewhat, and I just don't think that would work well for me. And I have no intention of going to a larger process. I'm doing this more as a hobby and to have syrup for family. So that's my plans. That's my experience in the first year. Please watch the video prior to this to show the actual process, and like and subscribe and stay tuned. I'm going to start videos on the Sugar Shack process. Thank you so much.